In March, Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland announced this year's budget, $498 billion. This was just 1 month after Freeland announced that Trudeau's government had increased their borrowing limit by $517 billion, an amount in excess of the entire annual budget, with virtually no announcement as to what the government would do with that money, and certainly nothing on how we would ever repay that debt. Canadians are already pushing back against the carbon tax, a tax where Minister Freeland, when questioned in Parliament recently, refused to disclose how much money the government is making from it. Now add to this the increase in capital gains tax, which most of you will be aware of by now. But there are other new or revised taxes within the budget as well. Peter Merrick is a Canadian living in the U.S. who is an expert in protecting assets by moving them from Canada to the U.S. while paying minimal tax. Peter read the entire 430-page budget. In this interview, Peter discloses the taxes in the budget that the government didn't want you to know about. We also discuss the question of why Trudeau's government is shipwrecking our economy. It's easy to say that Minister Freeland is unqualified for her position. Her only degree is in Slavonic studies, and what working background she has is in journalism. However, Chrystia Freeland also sits on the board of trustees for the World Economic Forum. Justin Trudeau, who appointed her to her position, is a graduate of the WEF's Young Global Leaders Indoctrination Program, and Klaus Schwab, who despite his recent retirement announcement is still currently the director of the WEF, boasted years ago that he controlled over half of Trudeau's cabinet. So is the most recent disastrous budget incompetence? Or is it something much darker? Part of an intentional plan to destroy our economy and bankrupt Canadians? And either way, what can you do to protect your assets when the inevitable collapse comes? The answer may surprise you. Peter, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Will.
I have to say I was just blown away when you emailed me and told me that you had read the entire budget. Now, of course, I just looked at the summary. What was this, 380 pages, something like that?
It was about 430 pages.
430, and you've read it all. So you're the financial expert. I'm going to basically hand the wheel to you. Where do you want to start, Peter?
Well, let's just talk about the major things that were talked about immediately, what I got out of the bill. I think that's very helpful for your readers. So let's start off with what the finance minister, what would you like to refer to her as? Because I don't even want to give the respect of mentioning her name. Maybe you can show a picture of her when you do the edits. She came out, and what did she say at the beginning of the budget? She said, this budget is for generational equity.
Wow.
What does that mean?
Well, I think now, I can read into it what I think it means, and it's not anything good.
Well, tell me what you think it means, and I'll tell you what I think it means, because I think by us sharing what we think it is, it'll help set
generational equity. That's another way of saying even our grandchildren won't pay this off.
Well, that's different than I read it, that you have worked hard, you have a home, you've contributed to the society, you have stuff. And to me, what it is they're going to take away from people who've actually created something in this country. The people who are the wealth generators.
Yes.
So you are terrible. And let's look at everything. The stage has been set. And I just want to give context to everyone. A lot of people are coming into Canada. They've been lied to. They've been told that Canada is the Canada of the 70s and the 80s. And they're coming to the major cities. About 1.5 million people are coming into Canada a year. 70% of them are ending up in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. And then the top 13 urban centers, you have 95%. They're not building enough houses. About 40% of that's going to Toronto. Toronto is only building about 20,000 units. They need about 150,000 units. People are angry. And we have to look back and remember what Klaus Schwab told us. We will have a much more angrier warring. So the finance minister, who has no economics training, except that she was a Rhodes Scholar, and anybody who was a Rhodes Scholar who studied successful roads could be considered somebody who should never have a position in any government other than the British because it's treasonous. She was also spoken about by the KGB before the KGB and the Soviet Union collapsed, that she was active in separatist neo-Nazi groups in the Ukraine.
Yes.
Her grandfather had never been in Canada, and I don't hold anyone responsible for who their grandparents are, but she's never announced. And she sits as a director in the World Economic Forum. How is that not a conflict of interest? I would even say something stronger because I'm not in your country, even though I'm Canadian.
Yes. Yeah. And let
me
add a couple of things.
That is treason. To me, that is treason. You cannot have two masters. The only master that she should have is Canadians, not the World Economic Forum.
Completely agreed. But we've got a whole bunch of people in Trudeau's government, including Trudeau himself, who are working for a foreign power against our interests. I just want to add a couple of things to what you were talking about Chrystia Freeland. First of all, her degree is in Slavonic studies. Her background is in journalism. She is no more qualified to be finance minister than I am. And I can tell you right now, I would probably be the worst finance minister in the world. I know nothing about this kind of stuff. Neither does she. Second, you were talking about the KGB. The KGB actually had a code name for her. I can't remember off the top of my head now what it is. But she has her own KGB code name. What does this tell you about the person who is driving our economy into the ground?
Well, it's not her. She's taking orders.
Absolutely, yes, she is. She is taking orders from her globalist masters to destroy our economy. So now we've talked
what I'd like to do, Will, is just go over the 5 things that stuck out when I read the budget. And then what I'd like to do is I'd like to get into specifics and discuss with you. So Number 1, there's something called the fact tax. So it's fact tax. This is a sales tax framework targeted on Indigenous communities under the guise of reconciliation. It's burdening them with collecting more taxes. And if anybody understands UNDRIP, and that happens to be a treaty where land is going to be given back to the native people. Basically, if they can't handle managing their own affairs, it goes to the UN. It's a backdoor to actually take away our sovereignty. Because
all part of UNDRIP.
Yes, UNDRIP.
Yes.
And they do not define what an Aboriginal individual is, because every cell in my body was conceived, grew up in Canada. How am I not an Indigenous person? However, this is a way that they're going to take away our national sovereignty. And already I was reading that in northern Vancouver Island, portion of land was given to the tribe, when Canadians who own land there, they don't know what type of rights they're going to have. So that's number 1, the fact tax.
Yes.
Number 2, there's
I'm sorry to jump in, but I need to add something to that.
Please.
Because it's very important. First of all, UNDRIP, for our viewers who may not know what that acronym means, it's the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It is nothing but a shell game to, as you said, steal our lands and resources. And I have it on authority from one of the lawyers in our country who's tracking all of this stuff, who, by the way, is Indigenous. The province of British Columbia and the territory of Nunavut are one legal pen stroke away from ceding the authority over all resources to the Aboriginals. And of course, they're not the ones calling the shots. Other people are controlling them. So you're absolutely right on that. That is this whole UNDRIP thing, everything you're talking about. This is a grab for our resources for control within our own country, to have foreign powers
by the UN.
By the UN.
By the UN.
Yes.
By the UN. And it's a backdoor. And one thing I do want to share, Will, for the last 15 years, every government group I saw, went to, heard, they were all mentioning that the native land that we were standing on belonged to some tribe. And a lot of the times the tribes didn't exist anymore, but they made it a point because it's a form of conditioning, getting us ready. Number two is the wealth tax. This is the implementation of a global minimum tax catered to demand to the World Economic Forum and other global institutions. So they're basically going to put a tax around the world, right? And it undermines the interest of Canadians in favor of serving the global elites that are telling Canadians what is in their best interest. Think about that. Let's go back to Chrystia Freeland. She is a director of the Economic Forum. And in essence, here's a tax that was being put in place, was mentioned in the budget. So that's like, wow. So you got these two taxes, you got the back tax, and then you have the left tax. And it's like you're going like, okay, how is this a Canadian budget? I don't know, but it gets better.
They're not even trying to hide it. I mean, sure, it's buried in this 430-page document, but it's right there in black and white. And you're absolutely right. I reported on this WEF tax, this globalist tax. And where does that money go? It goes to the globalists who want to control everything. So they will have more financial power to do so. But that's it. Let's use this word again. That's treason. You're taking money to the hands of Canadians and you're handing it to a hostile foreign power.
Yes. We all go back to the fact that what I said before, I think immigration is great. My grandparents came to Canada, but you have to actually have people who understand the society. Right now, people are being lied to, and I mean lied to. I feel bad for many of the immigrants who've come to Canada in the last few years. They were told that Canada was the Canada of the 70s and the 80s, and they're not finding jobs. They're not finding homes. They're angry because they get to Canada and they realize they were lied to.
Yeah, and in fact, roughly 1 out of every 5 of them leaves within. I'm sorry, I don't have the statistics off the top of my head, so I'm not going to try them because I'll get them wrong. But a high percentage of them leave within 4 years. And by the time you get to 20 years, it's something like 1 in 5. They came here, you're right, they were promised certain things, and they came here and they found out it's not true.
And an angrier world. Remember, that's what Klaus Schwab said, an angrier world where we're importing people who will become angry. And I know we're talking about the budget, but I believe what's happening with Gaza in Israel right now, that anger on the streets of Toronto and our universities, that's the anger. They're just using that as an excuse. They're angry. Students have debt. They don't have jobs. They're angry. And getting back to the beginning of the budget, when Chrystia Freeland spoke, she said she wants generational equity. She's pointing the blame at people who came before. They say the baby boomers, people who own homes, they're the ones who did it. Those people. And that is, in essence, what this budget is focused on. So let's go to
and actually, just before we move on, and I'm sorry to interrupt again, but this is a very important statistic, and this one I do remember, because I reported on this just a couple of weeks ago. There's a study done in Great Britain that looked at the GDP per capita as immigration increased. Because what they keep telling us, because they keep pointing to, well, the GDP is going up as a result of all the immigration, so immigration's good. But they're not talking about GDP per capita, how much money per person. Once you pass 1.5% of the population immigrating in a year, that starts to go down dramatically. Here in Canada, we're at 3.1%, which explains a lot of why, in the last few years, Canada has now become the absolute worst of the G7 nations on every single economic indicator.
When we project that a little forward, 10 years at 3.3%, it's 1/3 of the population.
Yes.
That's like, I have certain things I remember. Like, I'm figuring, well, you're my age. You remember Mr. Dress Up?
Yes.
Like, I say that someone who's my age in Toronto, they won't know who Mr. Dress Up was. There's nothing that brings us together.
No.
Like, there's no commonality. It's like there's civility. There's also the rule of law. Like, the cultures that are in Canada before this mass immigration, they're from cultures that had the Reformation and the Enlightenment, so we can have debate. What happens if you come from a culture that doesn't have that? Not saying these people can't learn it, but it takes generations for them to learn it.
Yes.
This creates a bit of a problem.
And to do that, you have to bring them in a small enough number that they are forced to assimilate into Canadian society. When you're bringing in 500,000 people a year, what happens, and I see this happening right here in my own city of Calgary, of course, it's happening in large cities across the country. There's so many immigrants from a certain country that what they do is they all start to live in the same area. A lot of them, especially if they come from some of the African countries that are very patriarchal, where women are still being treated like property, a lot of the wives not only can't speak English, their husbands prevent them from learning English, so that they're still totally dependent upon the man in the house. And so, yeah, we've got these large groups of people now coming in who have no reason to assimilate into Canadian culture because there's enough of them. They brought their culture with them. They're surrounded by people from their country.
Unfortunately, a number of these people brought their hate with them too.
Yes, and a lot of them hate us.
And we can see that. So let me just backtrack. So we have the FACT Act, which is natives or the native tribes are going to have to start collecting more taxes. And if they're not able to do it, the UN's going to step in. And we mentioned that it's tied to UNDRIP. We also have the WEF tax, where they're basically going to have a minimum tax. They're saying if you're not collecting enough tax, well, you have to do it because these funds have to go to the UN, which a few years ago, the UN and the World Economic Forum, they went together, and they're basically, the think tank happens to be the World Economic Forum. Then you also have corporate tax increase, and that makes Canada, which we were a very competitive country with corporate taxes under Harper. We had one of the best. When it came to small business tax over 500,000, the tax ranges from anywhere from 13% down to 12%. It's very competitive. In 2017, they attacked small businesses. Now they're raising corporate taxes. It's becoming more expensive because there's so many things have gone up. You've got minimum wage going up. You've got inflation, everything. It's becoming very difficult. And one of the things that I recall, that about 80% of all the jobs that were created since the pandemic were government jobs. Canada and the G7, as a quarter of the working population work for some form of government or some quasi corporation that is actually run by the government. So this is like having a fat man on a healthy man. Like you're not going to be able to carry that person. And this is driving business people out. Another thing that was introduced is a vacant land tax. So if I have land that I'm not using, they're going to tax me on that land, an additional tax.
Yes.
Now, the one that everyone's talking about, and we're going to focus on this in just a second, is the capital gains hikes. But I just want to go over before I leave these 4 taxes we talked about, because I want to focus on the capital gains tax hike and also on the bear trusts, because these are things that I think are creepers that are going to destroy what's left of Canada. I want to give you some antidotes because I don't have any studies, but I can tell you the people I'm speaking to and what they're telling me, and the slight money on Canada. So we mentioned the FACT tax, which is a tax that is going to be put on to natives to charge the rest of us and to administer it. There's the WEF tax, where there's going to be a minimum tax that every nation in the world is going to have to charge this tax, and they're probably going to have to pay it off to the UN or the World Economic Forum. There's the corporate tax increases, and then there's the vacant land tax. And if you're not utilizing the land, they're going to penalize you for it. And they'll end up, you'll owe money on land that's not producing anything for you, so they'll be able to take your land. Well, they introduced the capital gains tax hike. And what they've done is it was on 50% inclusion. So what that means, there's two aspects of it, because there's secondary taxes that people weren't thinking about. If I sold a big piece of property over, big piece of property, only 15%, 50% would be inclusion. So let's imagine it's really wealthy. I'm going to use a big number. People get excited with big numbers. So if I sold, let's say, a $10 million piece of land and it was profit, 50% would be tax-free. Only 50% of that would be taxed. So let's say the tax rate is 50%. So you'd pay the government $2.5 million. That would go to the government. And then I'd end up with $2.5 million. So in total, I would have 75% of my gain would be mine. Now, I want to impress upon everybody that the initial investment I made in that property was with after-tax dollars.
Yes.
So I already paid my tax, and I made more money, and I'm paying more tax. But that happens with when we pay our gas, when we pay HST, all that stuff. This is after-tax money. Now, it gets worse when it's a business, because most business owners, especially if they own property or they're wealth producers for our society, because if you have someone who, makes money, they buy and they hire people and they, it's transactions, and that creates the GDP, the more transactions there are. So let's imagine someone sells a $10 million profit on a piece of real estate. So right now it's 50 until June 25th, until it changes. They would be able to take $5 million, pass it out of the company. There'd be $2.5 million would be taxed, and $2.5 million would be stuck in the company. And the only way they take that $2.5 million that's stuck in the company is they dividend it out, and they'd be paying about a 40% tax rate. So at the end of the day, they would end out with about $6.3 million in their pocket for taking the money out. Now let's go and look at the changes, because they're moving it up from, let's say, the 26% up to 35%. So what does that mean? Well, you have someone who sells, let's say, they're giving personally the first $250,000. It's going to be, the old rate, and then they're going to step it up. It does not apply to business owners, but let's deal with them. They make it seem that these wealthy people are the same people every year. And they're not. People who actually go over that level, it's usually, most of them, it only happens once in their lifetime. It's about 44,000 taxpayers a year. That's it. And only 15% of those people ever do it twice. So it's not like it's wealthy people. This is hitting middle-class people. I have a cottage. I might have a little rental. I have a huge stock portfolio. It's not a big event that happens to the same people, the 44,000, when they make it seem like the wealthy. It's really the middle class they're going after, because people it's a capital gain. They're selling something that might be significant, that wasn't taxed, that's going to be taxed. So it's a lie when they say they're going after the 1%, because that 1%, in many cases, changes every single year. It's middle-class people who are finally realizing that gain. Now let's talk about business owners, because this is like a double taxation. It's double taxation. So let me just give you a simple example that just I worked out the numbers, and I'm just going to use a tax rate of, let's say, 50%, for a number. So in my first example, I had a building. I sold it for $10 million profit. I end up paying $2.5 million to the government, and I have $5 million comes out tax free. I have $2.5 million that's stuck in the company. If I wanted to dividend that money out, what I'm going to be left with is about $6.3 million after tax. Now, under the new situation, because it's 35% tax, I'm going to only be able to take out tax-free $3 million, $2 million less. I'm going to pay $3.5 million in tax, and I'm going to have $3.5 million stuck in the company. If I dividend that money out, I'm going to have to pay $1.5 million taxes, so I'm only going to have $5 million. So instead of having the $6.3 million after I take it out of my business, I'm only going to have $5 million.
Right.
They just stole money with the second tax.
Right. And the government now has $1.3 million more.
If I was an individual, and right now they've raised it to 35% tax if you have, but they're giving you the first $250,000. Well, let's think about that. Well, it's like there's rapid inflation happening. Like that's going to end up being nothing. Like
well,
so they give it.
Peter, I'm going to ask you. Let's give people a real example because you're right. There's an awful lot of middle class people out there who are going to be affected by this. So I'm going to throw out an example for you. Let's talk about the middle class person who 20, 25 years ago, they bought a rental property as an investment. They've been managing it now on their own all of those years, looking after it, getting a tenant in there, collecting the rent, doing the upkeep on the property. And now they can sell it for $400,000 more than they paid for it.
Yep.
Let's look at what they would have gotten before they changed the capital gains and what they would get now.
So based on that, on the first $250,000 that they receive, it's going to be they'll have to pay about 50. Let me just do it. I'm sorry, I'm doing a quick calculation. It's easier if I did it as $1 million than the 400,000.
Okay, let's change it. Let's.
Okay,
we're getting a little bit extreme for middle class, but there's some people out there. In fact, I personally know somebody who owns an apartment building. Okay, so they turn around, they sell an apartment building. Now they're looking at selling it.
It's just easier because they can up and down it because it's
so
like
they sell it for $1 million more than what they paid for it. There's their capital gains. How much of that are they going to keep now as opposed to what they would have kept before these changes to the capital gains tax?
Okay, so just on a basic number, they're going to have to, they would have approximately paid in the past about $250,000 in tax. And now they're going to end up paying about $300,000. And the reason it's going to be $300,000 because the new taxation does not kick in until the first $250,000. And the point that I was sharing with you, which I want our viewers to understand, that it's great. They fixed it as a number of $250,000, so a lot of people won't have a gain more than $250,000. But there's been rapid inflation.
Yep.
Like someone who bought a home in Vancouver for $100,000, let's say in 1980, the thing's worth a fortune.
Yes. And there's lots of that. Because we were just talking about an investment property. I need you to inform me on this, Peter, because I'm still unclear whether this capital gains applies to your primary residence because it didn't used to.
It doesn't. But I do want to share something with you. And we're going to talk about the Barrett Trust. And we haven't got in there yet because that's the part that really scares me, is that a few years ago, when you sold your principal residence, they required that you filled out a form and you notified the government that never happened before. They want to know you sold your principal residence. If you do not fill out that form, when I sold my principal residence in Canada, if you had not filled it out and notified the federal government, it was an $8,000 penalty. Now, you did not pay tax on it, but they said you have to tell us.
Right.
So I only look at what I'm told. And what I mean by that is I put things together, I do conjectures, and this is where I'm going to step outside what the regular person in the financial industry would talk about. I look at what the end goal is, and I look at what's been told. So, for example, we've mentioned earlier that Chrystia Freeland happens to be a director of the World Economic Forum. So let's go and step back and look at Klaus Schwab. What has he told us? He said to us that you will own nothing and be happy. He literally said that.
Yes.
So that's the goal. Because I shared with you before a situation, an experience I've had in my first year of university, and I think this is important for all your listeners to understand. In my first year university, I was taking a psychology course, and there were multiple choice exams, and you took 6 of them, and the worst one got thrown out. And the professor said that if you got 0 on any one of these tests that had 50 questions, he would give you 100% because statistically it was impossible to get 0. That meant you had to do it intentionally. So let's step back. Can they be this stupid? Because I listened to all these accountants, a lot of tax lawyers, and they say they're so stupid, they're destroying our business, whatever. Don't they know? Don't they understand? Well, if it's constantly happening, it's intentional. So I step back because they're not looking at the fact that Chrystia Freeland happens to be sitting as a director of the World Economic Forum. They're not paying attention that her father worked for George Soros, that she was going to write his biography, that she's a lifetime friend. And I don't understand that because he's Jewish and her grandfather was heard under Hitler, under Goebbels, and I'm thinking, well, maybe he was MK'd out. That's just my opinion. I don't know. My opinion, he was placed there. She was placed there. But if you look at that, you say, okay, the end goal that he's come out and said, you will own nothing and be happy. So let's go and look at all this stuff that's happening. It's destroying Canadian business. It's making it to the point where you can't own anything, that you won't have anything, that if you screw up and you don't file all these forms, you're going to have government's going to seize it from you. You own nothing and be happy. They got UNDRIP, but they're basically saying that the land belongs to the native of Canada, but they don't define what an Aboriginal is. It could be you, me. Up until I was 50 years old, except for going away for a year or 2 or 3 in my entire life, every atom in my body had been conceived and nourished in Canada. Doesn't that make me native? My parents were native, right? So you're looking at that. They want to take all the land and transfer it over to the indigenous population. We don't know how that's defined, but in essence, if they can't administer, it goes to the UN. It says that in the treaty. It's been signed by our government in 2005. It's there. And I want to share with you something that scares me as a Canadian. And I made a commitment to myself that I'm going to work with Canadians who see this and are waking up and saying, maybe I don't want to be in Canada anymore because I have the ability right now. Is they introduced in this budget Section 150, and that is bear trusts. And what that is, it has to do with anything that's a trust or an agreement. So it could be a verbal agreement too. If I do not report that to the government the way it's actually written, I will be offside. And they will levy penalties on me. It's going to be administrative, impossible for the average human being. For example, I'll use this example. Your mother doesn't tell you that she's made you the executor of the will. You did not tell the government that you were the executor of the will. So guess what? You are in trouble. You don't even know that you're executor of the will. Or you go and open a bank account for your son or your daughter, and you have not told the government about this. Well, that's a bare trust. So in essence, they're going to make it so administrative difficulty for the average Canadian. Well, anything over $100 will make them a criminal.
Yes.
And I could see what they would do, what I would do, because if I used the term, if I was the devil, what would I do? I would go and make it so difficult. Like they did during COVID. It's like the government, like they put all these restrictions. We've never gone back to normal, but they release you from your home, things that like your natural rights, and Canadians put up with it. They're going to make it so difficult administratively that everybody is going to be offside. And then the government's going to say, we're such good people. What we're going to do is we're going to relieve you of this stress. All you have to do is switch over to our centralized digital currency and have social ID, and we'll go into your bank accounts. We'll take care of it all for you. And if you do that, we will forgive you of the $400,000 of administrative penalties that you've accumulated because you've broken the law.
Yeah.
So they just turned every single Canadian, if this gets through, this section in the Income Tax Act that no one's talking about, everybody over $100 will be a criminal in Canada. And in essence, you look at the end goal, you own nothing to be happy. You want to herd the cats or the sheep into the corral. And that's exactly all this stuff makes sense, because if you look at it independently, you say, how is the government so incompetent? I think that AI models that they know exactly you and I exist. Well, they know you and I exist. They know a certain percentage of the population are going to be like you and I. And we're going to say, I see this, and we're going to tell people, and they know that, and they're going to isolate us, and they're going to get the sheep, the sleeples to attack us, that we're crazy, because we're actually pointing out that this doesn't make sense. Well, this makes perfect sense to me. So when I look at the budget, it doesn't make sense. Like, why would someone want to destroy a country? Why would they want to have so much debt? Why would they make decisions that just make no sense? Because if we go back to Klaus Schwab, and he says, you owe nothing and be happy. And then if we go to 2017, when he's at Harvard and he's speaking about one of his great proteges, happens to be the young Justin Trudeau, and he went to a cocktail party for the Canadian cabinet, and he was so proud that 60% of them at that time were graduates of the young global leaders. And you know what they don't talk about? There's the young global influencers, and they are throughout the Canadian government.
Yes.
And I had a personal experience, and I'm not going to mention the person's name, but this individual, it looked like I was a liberal, not because I was a liberal, because a client of mine, a colleague of mine who I wrote with, he decided he wanted to get back to Canada. So he ran twice for the Liberal government, the Liberal Party, but they lost. And this is during the Harper era. So he had a brilliant idea. His idea was he was going to run for leadership and just raise his profile as a lawyer. He wasn't, I kept on writing checks to him because, he's a friend of mine. I said, if these idiots get into power, you'll be able to be the only normal person there. So he ends up, running for his riding in Ottawa. He wins. Well, because he's not part of the young global leaders, they decide to take away the riding, and they put in someone who is the former head of NATO. So there's no democracy. There's no you picking your leaders. They're all selected. They don't get there. I don't trust the conservative head. I don't trust any of these people because they don't get there unless they were selected. And a little about my background. I was in student government. And unfortunately, one of the people that I was in student government with was Jean Ghomeshi. You remember Jean Ghomeshi?
It's ringing a bell, but you have to remember that 3 or 4 years ago, I paid no attention to politics, so you'll have to refresh me.
No, this wasn't politics. This wasn't politics. He was the Me Too movement. He had a show on CBC radio.
Okay. Yes.
And he was the first Me Too. There were a bunch of lawsuits against him for harassment and everything. So I just want to share with you, when his degree was in women's studies. Pretty interesting, right?
Yeah.
So what I noticed when I was in student government, there were 2 types of people. They're betas and they're psychopaths. betas will just do whatever. I have no backbone. And then you've got people who, they like the power. And if they were able to get away with something, they will get away with it. And it's a way for them to see that in normal people like you and I, we want to go on with our business and be left alone.
Right.
And the perfect example is you're saying 4 years ago, you didn't pay attention to politics. Why should you? You and I were like going and like living our lives, and we looked at the government as a cold sore that you just want to like keep under control. That's literally how I looked at it. And until they moved into my world, and they did move into our world. So getting back to the budget looks like it was put together by real idiots who just don't understand how economics and finance work. And this is the way most people are approaching your professions, because they don't have, I was going to say balls. Let's say the truth, because God forbid, right? Like I'm not in Canada anymore. I'm going to speak the truth right now, because it hurt. I cried during the lockdowns because I love Canada. When we last spoke, I was looking at your flag, and it's that was emotional for me, because I drank in the Kool-Aid that Canada was the greatest country in the world. I truly believe it was the greatest country in the world. It gave my family so much opportunity. I'm from Toronto. It was a safe city. It's not safe anymore. There's a stabbing or a shooting every day. That was non-existent when I was growing up. It was civil. There wasn't outright racism. There wasn't protest. Let's protest in Canada, right? However, it's not like that anymore.
Right.
And this budget is just, if you look at what's happening, is they're giving us 1,000 little cuts and moving us towards an end goal. And Canadians are polite, and hopefully there's enough of us who are what started the trucker protest, because I don't think anybody agreed to this. Nobody agreed to this. The equity that's being pushed on us, the changes to the criminal and human rights codes, the carbon taxes, the mass immigration, all these things. Nobody agreed to this.
Right. And
this budget is no different. This budget, no one agreed to this. And on top of that, this is meant to make Canada unproductive. This is meant to take every cent away. I want to share with you what I'm hearing from my colleagues who are accountants and lawyers and tax about what's happening with the money in Canada, because it's scary. Every single Canadian is there, because you're going to be stuck with the bill. It's going to be like when you were invited to a birthday party when you were a kid, and if you stayed long enough and you guys didn't take individual bills, you ended up for a hamburger spending $300 because there were people who left you didn't pay. Well, guess what? The money is running, and I want to address that in a moment. Sorry for jumping in. Share with me, Will.
No, it's okay. And I do want to get to that in a minute. But I'm also glad, because there's another tax we haven't really talked about yet. You just mentioned it, the carbon tax. And when questioned, once again, talking about Ms. Freeland here, when questioned in Parliament about how much money the government was bringing in the carbon tax, she refused to answer the question. So we've got this tax that is crippling our economy, especially for businesses, to supposedly address a problem that doesn't exist, because my viewers and you understand there is no such thing as man-made global warming. It's total BS. And they won't even tell us how much money they're bringing in. So we don't even know anymore.
They're not telling us where that money's going either.
Yeah,
they're not telling us where that money's going.
Yeah, prior to this interview, I looked up how much money does the government bring in every year. The most recent figure we have for taxation income for the federal government is 2022, $433 billion. But now, even if we had the 2023 figure, it's incomplete, because we don't know how much they're getting from the carbon tax.
We don't know where that money's going. We do not know where that money is going. And in essence, we're what's happening is they're hitting us at all sorts of ways, and they're calling us names.
So, Peter, talking about, you were mentioning just a few minutes ago, things you're hearing from your accountant friends in Canada. And I want the viewers to keep in mind that this is all within the context of everything we've been discussing, that not just this budget, but everything that Trudeau's government has done since 2015 is designed to shipwreck our economy and to bankrupt Canadians. So with that in mind, please tell us what you're hearing from the accountants.
Well, for many of you, your viewers, a little background on myself. I was a university prof teaching finance. I wrote books on succession planning, estate planning, 3 textbooks. I wrote for the largest accounting publication for 18 years. So I know the top people in the country. You know, I worked with them, I interviewed with them, I worked on cases as a consultant, and I like to write. So what's happened is there's a flight of cash. There's people leaving. I have a colleague who's working on 3 individuals worth over $1.2 billion. I didn't say million, I said $1 billion. They were leaving. They'd had enough. The lockdowns and everything, very patriotic. They're out west. They're in your part of the world. And because of the changes for the capital gains, he told them that you have to leave this week. Because if they stay and cut off ties to Canada after June 25th, they're going to be taxed at about 30% more than they would have if they left afterwards. So they're running. And then the analogy a lot of them are having, who are really starting to think about leaving, they don't like about the protests and all the things that have happened in Canada, the month that's about to happen, the fact that they're not allowed to raise their children, all that stuff, or their grandchildren, the anti-Semitism that's rising up. Because let's be honest, it doesn't matter what's happening 6,000 miles away, like what's happening on those campuses, because history shows if you get attacked in any country, it's like that's a canary. That's a canary in the coal mine, because Hitler killed 6 million Jews, but there were 100 million people who died in the Second World War, and hundreds of millions of people were gained. And there's something called the Jewish test, and it's also called the Israel test. If you look at how a country treats its Jews, if the Jews do well, it means the country is very liberal and free. If they treat them really bad, for like Syria and Iran and all those things, you have to look at them. It's a form of protectionism. Like, so in essence, Canadians, you better start fighting this anti-Semitism that's being allowed to be produced in Canada, because it's about taking down your rights. Because guess what's going to happen? They're going to be these terrorist attacks, whatever, and it's going to be a great excuse for the government to actually lock down. And I was told by a good friend of mine that the Canadian Army is understaffed, and right now they're taking refugees or people who didn't come in, like, you know, people who have no connection to Canada, and they're actually putting them in the army. And you should probably speak to that more than I can, but it's like, pay attention. So what's happening right now, there's people who say, I have the means to leave. And we're talking billions of dollars are leaving. I have a colleague out west. He's got like 700 files. I'm not going to give his name, but he's got 700 files, and people are just giving up on Canada. I know firms in Toronto that they might do with 6 people a year who are leaving Canada. They've got about 200 people who are lining up. I was speaking to one of my largest clients in Toronto, and he's starting the process. So we went to a firm in Buffalo, and the firm in Buffalo, we're talking, this is a wealthy individual. Family's very wealthy. Canada's going to lose a wealthy individual. And this firm in Buffalo that has specialized in doing cross-border for Canadian accounting firms and law firms, they said they couldn't help them, and they're not taking on a new client for a year because they have to service their current clientele coming from Toronto. Think about what that means. Think about the brain drain. Think about who's going to be left over. Could you imagine like who's going to be left over in Canada? because it's not going to be the people who actually made the country great. I remember when my wife got her Canadian citizenship, and she was American. Well, everyone on the podium, they were all recent Canadians. It's like, I'm going to tell you about Canada, and I didn't have that experience. You and I just had that conversation. When I talk about Mr. Dress-Up, you know who I'm talking about.
Yes, but I want to ask a question, Peter. Something just occurred to me as you were speaking. And you're talking about all this money that's leaving the country. And of course, that means they're selling off assets. They're leaving all this stuff behind. And I want to go back to the vacant land tax that we were talking about earlier, because what I interpret there, because we know that foreign powers are buying up an awful lot of property in Canada, especially the Chinese, but lots of others, so that they basically end up owning all the property here. I think the vacant land tax is there to push people to sell it now before they're getting taxed for it. And who's going to buy it? Foreign investors who will build houses on it or rental properties on it because they want everybody renting. So they want to own all of this. So now where my mind goes with this is you talk about all of these very wealthy people who are leaving the country, selling off their assets. Well, who's grabbing up those assets and what are they doing with them?
Now let's take it a step further. The closer you are to the printing press, better, the cheaper you get money, right? So who's buying it, right? It's like, you're exactly right. Like somebody is able to go and get the huge deficit, all the graft, all the everything that the government's producing. These people are getting access to that cash. They're getting access to that cash. Can I share with you something that I found very interesting, especially to the business owners that are on this, who are listening to us right now? Because I can't help but think about the conjectures. And there was a book that I would recommend everybody read. It was given to me about 25 years ago, and it's powerful. It's called The Long View. It's by Peter Schwartz. And I'll give some background and give some context and how it can be used for you to actually look at what's happening and have a perspective. Because I think that framework is very powerful, because that's how I operate. And I have to give credit to that book. So Peter Schwartz worked for Royal Dutch Shell. They were one of the largest, oil companies in the world. And he was part of their planning group. And they were making a decision where they're going in the early 80s, late 70s, where they're going to invest in, developing new oil field. And they looked at the best case scenario, the status quo, and the worst case. So the worst case scenario was, what would cause the oil price to go down? That would be the worst case. Based on that, they said, well, the Soviet Union could sell to Western Europe. So they started going to universities and looking at papers, and they were able to even identify Gorbachev as being an up and coming, that he could eventually become the premier, and he wanted perestroika and open up. And that would allow the oil to go down, because Russia would be able to sell all their oil to Western Europe. So they made the decision not to develop oil fields, and they fared a lot better when the price dropped from like $9. So he wrote a book called The Art of the Long View. And he goes and says, look at the best case scenario, look at the status quo, and look at the worst case, and do projections. So I look at what's happening, and I start asking questions of what the government's doing and what it's going to do next. And actually, it's not like these people are so creative. It's so different than when Hollywood, they do remakes of movies. They knew how it works. So for business owners right now, what's being pushed happens to be life insurance by financial firms right now, brokers, people who don't understand what's going to happen. And the reason why life insurance is being pushed is because if you take corporate money, after-tax money, that let's say you earned at 12% or let's say 26%, you can buy into a life insurance policy, grows tax-free, and then when you die, the money is fully comes out tax-free out of the company. No other asset does that. And you could use it, unlike an RSP, you can use it as collateral personally. You can live on it personally tax-free, and eventually it's all going to come out tax-free. So right now, there's nothing else left for a business owner other than to buy a life insurance policy with the money that they accumulated within their company. Well, right now, that's the only thing that's left. And I'm starting to think that there's got to be these super AI computers out there that actually understand what we're going to do next, right? Because it's not like individually I can't predict what you're going to do, Will, but we can go and predict.
Well, there
the
are.
vast majority of people are going to do.
I believe there are, based on what I've been told, and I cannot confirm this. I've been able to confirm it myself, but I heard it from someone I consider to be a reliable source, that for over 10 years now, BlackRock, most of their decisions have been made by an AI.
Oh, yeah. They've got something, I think it's called Aladdin, and it influences $24 trillion worth of assets. So they're only managing about 10 trillion, but they're influencing 24 trillion. So you're right. I was listening recently that AI has really been around for like 25 years now. And what we're seeing with ChatGPT, that's like, I don't know, like a newborn.
Yes. And I agree with that theory. And I agree with that theory on the basis of something else that I know. When you go out there and you buy the latest cell phone, okay, they've got technology way beyond that. They release them, just these little upgrades to maximize profit.
Well, it's not just profit. I don't think it's profit anymore. I think it's about control. I really think
it is. But I'm talking historically.
Control.
I mean, cell phones, we've had those for 30 years now. And yes, they developed technology to make them much more powerful, much faster. They've had that for ages, but they released them, just these little improvements, so that they can maximize the profit. And I think it's the same thing with the AI. What we are seeing, because remember, Sam Altman, OpenAI, who is one of the globalists very closely associated with WEF, he didn't want AI to get into public hands. This was a major disagreement that, by the way, Elon Musk had with him, and why they went their separate ways, is because Musk saw what they wanted to do with AI, and Altman didn't want the public to have it. And I think what we're seeing is just these little dribbles of that technology. What the government, what people like Altman have, is way beyond anything we've seen.
Well, I even take it a step further. I've gotten to the point where it's like, it's just demonic. Like I don't have the ability to fully process it, but it's just what's happening is just anti-human and evil.
Yes.
And that's really what I'm looking at.
Anti-human is exactly the word, because what have many of these globalists come right out and said? They want to depopulate the world.
Right. And that's really what it comes down to.
Kill off a huge number of them.
That's really when I look at the budget and I see what happens, and I say, look, and all these taxes and all these things that they're doing, really it all leads to that.
Yes.
Getting rid of humans. And I think what it comes down to is there's too many people like you and I. There's enough room on the planet for 10 times more people. However, people like you and I who are asking questions, we're dangerous. So you have to thin down the herd.
Yeah. Well, don't down the herd
because we're manageable.
Because I can explain how overpopulation is self-correcting.
I think it's a lie. I think it's a real lie. I actually did a calculation a while before. I don't think there's 8 billion people. I added up the top 500 cities. I took in the greater areas. There would be maybe a billion and a half people. And then if you put like a billion people in the rural areas, that's less than 3 billion people. It's really, it really is a control thing. It's like they get us to believe things that are not true. I truly believe it comes down to that the only thing that's not sellable is your soul. So I want to share a few things with your people. I work very closely with Adrian Spitter.
Yes.
I think he does God's work. I really do. There's 2 people I've worked in my career who are doing it because they don't have all the answers, but they're doing the best they can, and they're searching, they're bringing that information to people. If the market falls down, if it collapses, because it's not fiat currency, which isn't real. It's people know how their money is actually created. We've talked about that before. It's like make believe. Like, why don't I get like the monopoly money, because it's not real and they can just produce it and it loses value. So I don't trust cryptos. I personally don't trust them because this guy Tosho or whatever created like Bitcoin, like no one knows who he is. Like, come on, they create this story and they get all these people in and they think that this is real. Listen, if I can't hold it, I have a can of Coke right here. right? I can hold it. I can touch it. So in essence, I think that things are going to blow up that are worth nothing in order of blowing up. And Adrian and I made this list, and more Adrian than me. For those of you who are not dealing with Adrian, you should call him up. A really bright guy. Deals.
Yes.
It's religion for him.
What little I know about finance on a global scale, I learned from Adrian. So I agree with you.
And him and I have conversations all the time. We laugh all the time. Don't trust cryptos. I don't trust cryptos. I don't know who created it. In essence, and if the power goes out, how are you going to get it? I was hearing these fraudsters, and that's what I would call it, because they can do pump and dump, on this stuff, saying, "Oh, if the net fell down, or they're going to have handheld radios, and that's how they're going to go and tell you for currency." You can't hold it. See, that's a problem. We materialized everything, but we're still material beings, right? So crypto derivatives. These things are crazy. I was told that the debt worldwide is, I don't know, really about $400 or $500 trillion, not like the 32 trillion they're talking about. But if you put the derivatives there, they're quadrillions, and nobody's backstopping it. It's all this belief. It's not real. And then there's GIC, T-bills, and cash. Those things, instead of that, you would want to own gold, something that is tangible. Maybe for some people, not in Canada, you can't do it. Maybe bullets or worth something you can actually be exchanged with it. Food, farmland, things like that. Have a skill, make a community, right? Own property, own things that you can touch. I'm going to share something with your audience. I worked on the Canadian Securities course, and I'm telling you, I worked on the course. This is what brokers have to take. I own gold and real estate. I don't like stocks. I don't own crypto. I was recently on a call. I became good friends with Justin Trudeau's brother, Kyle Kemper. We're just friends. And Kyle, he's a black sheep in his family, and I've
interviewed Kyle. Yes.
Yeah, he liked crypto, and he was teaching us crypto, and he asked me if I had a wallet, and the thing is, I don't, because I like touching things. I like having conversations with people. I like walking. I like doing things. So, alternative types of investments, which would be single family rentals, would be your personal rentals. It'd be things that you could touch. If you're going to be in the beat system, I would recommend you buy life insurance products rather than banks. And I want to explain that to your audience, what I mean by that. Remember, I was sharing with you that they're herding all the business owners, all their assets into life insurance. And this is a theory, a conjecture. It has to do with what I was sharing with the art of the long view, best case, status quo, worst case. So they're getting all these people who don't ask the questions that you're asking, that your audience is asking, like, what's the worst case scenario? They're saying, oh, this is available. I can do this. I've got $500,000. I'm going to in my corporation. I'm going to shove it into a life insurance policy because it grows tax free, and I can use it as collateral. And then when I die, the money will come out tax free. And they're all being herded into that. The only reason it makes sense is, unlike when we were talking about the capital gains in a corporation, where only 50% of it currently is eligible to be taxed, and it's going up to 66% is going to be taxable. If you put the money into a life insurance policy and you die, none of it's taxable. So you can see, what is life insurance? It is a policy of the government. They know what it does. It's been told that it's for widows and orphans, and if you have money, you can drive a truck through it. It's basically written in the Income Tax Act. They know exactly what it is. So if I was the government, I would allow all this money to go in, because a lot of our financial institutions are having problems right now. Everyone would go into it. And I'm going to share with the audience something that's counterintuitive in a second. So what's going to happen is people, like all these people selling us, say, oh, the insurance companies are so big, they wouldn't allow the government to get rid of the capital dividend account. Well, there's lots of history where the government just changed the rules. So imagine they do that. People, their motivation for buying a corporately owned insurance policy was the tax benefits, but then the government says, no, why should business owners get an unfair advantage over the regular folk? Like someone who works for the government of Canada about the pension plan, right? Why should they have an unfair advantage, right? And listen to this. And this is something I've never said, and I'm saying this on your program, and this is a prediction, and I got to share with you, my colleagues back in Canada are going to be hating me for saying this. I believe that the insurance companies are going to say, oh, we're going to fight for you. We don't want, them to get rid of the capital dividend account. It goes against like 100 years of like tradition, like the government shouldn't do this. They're going to fight for it. But then they're going to lose because we know what's happening, right? I read the budget, right? They put in the fact tax for native. They put in capital gains. They put in the WEF tax. They put in the capital gains increase, and they put in the vacant tax. And they're also going to be putting in that legislation for buried trust. So the insurance companies are going to be our heroes, and they're going to go and lobby the government because they make such big contributions. They're going to lose.
Yeah.
And you know why they want to lose? Here's the counterintuitive part. You insurance companies do better if you pay the premium or you cancel the policy.
I don't know.
Just take a guess. Counterintuitive.
My guess as an average person would be they're better off if you're paying the premium because they got the income coming in. But I suspect that's not the answer.
No, that's the counterintuitive part. The lapses. They make the money on the lapses. So basically, they're forced to have reserves. Insurance companies are better than banks. Like any of your clients who are going to buy, let's say, GICs, I would say come to me, buy a GIC from an insurance company, but not any type. But I'll talk about, so they lapse. So I'll give you an example. You have a participating life insurance policy. There's a reason why the stock companies such as Manulife and Sun Life want to sell you what they call a universal life policy, because when the lapses happen, that's profit because they have to keep reserves. They can release those reserves. So those monies are going to go to the owners. That's why pension funds love owning it. BlackRock loves owning insurance company. That's why Warren Buffett loved owning insurance companies, because when they project the rate of return, they look at what the bonds are and what the real estate's earning, and they say, oh, you're 5%. And that's what they're legally allowed to project. But if you look at some of these, mutual life companies, the actual dividend being paid is 10, 11% consistently.
Okay. So,
so I want to share with your audience that I would buy products at a life insurance company, which means the policy holders are the ones who get those lapses.
Yes.
Because there's going to be a lot of lapses happening. Because if someone sold to me the life insurance, not for the death benefit. Yeah, I love my kids. I want to take care of them, estate planning and all that stuff. And that's what I tell for tax purposes for the government to say there's an actual reason for it. But I'm buying it because I am able to take $500,000 in shelter from the government, access that money by pledging it as collateral when I die. The loan's paid off with tax-free money. Well, when that's taken away, a lot of people who went into those policies, they're going to cancel their policies. And the question is, are you set up that if you're going to be in it for the long term, are you going to benefit? And you have to be in a mutual life company because all those cancellations are going to work out. I'll give you a real example. I don't know if when you had kids, did someone approach you to buy life insurance on your kids?
Yes, they did.
So usually what happens, those are really great for people who are wealthy, who are fooled with those people. So a lot of kids who their parents said, hey, I got $30,000 for you in a policy, it's cash. And they can keep this policy forever and they can grow whatever, or they can cancel it. What happens usually?
Usually gets canceled, of course.
That's right. And they buy a motorcycle.
Right.
So basically what's going to happen is there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be like those kids because they bought the policy like because they weren't buying it because of for the death benefit. They were buying it for the tax advantage. So once that is taken away, you're going to see tons of policies being canceled. Insurance companies are going to have record profits, and Canadians are going to be further screwed.
Okay.
So what I'm going to...
I want to throw something else into the mix here, because once again, and I think I'm good off asking this question, because most of the viewers are going to have about the same level of financial knowledge that I have. There's a lot of the stuff that we don't understand. So when you start talking about insurance as being a good investment, the first thing that I leap to, being who I am and the data that I have, is this 40% increase in deaths in the working age group since 2021. And we all know where that's coming from.
Yep.
And so I know that insurance companies, they have their actuaries whose, their job is to calculate the odds to make sure that the insurance company will remain solvent. Have they calculated in this? I mean, what happens when all these people start dying and they have to pay out all these policies?
Oh, let's go and look at most of the sudden death that you're referring to. That's over now. It's like the slow death, right? And people now have to go into their savings. And what are they going to cancel? What's going to go first?
Right.
And they need food, and they need to go. What are they going to cancel first? So guess what?
When you have to pay your heat, you got to put food on the table for your kids. Yeah,
and you have a big, and you'll let it go. And they know that's going to happen. This is all built like these actuaries, and I think it's beyond actuaries now. They got this AI that they basically could do 20,000 calculations in a minute. But this has been planned.
Right. And what you're telling me about the insurance companies is far from being under threat of going broke. They're going to make record profits.
Oh my God. So much. They're so set up to make money. Oh yeah. It's going to right now. Let me share with you. The people aren't having young families anymore. So they're having record profits or money going into these policies because it's tax efficient, because it has something called, when the person dies, let's say with a capital gain on a building, you're only going to be able to take $3 million out and end up with $5 million. With the life insurance, if I paid the money into it, let's say I put $1 million into it and the death benefit's $10 million, that comes out tax free. All of it. You'd only end up with half of that. You can't get, and you have access to your money and it's got benefits. But what happened if they took the benefit away? And there's so many things. Remember I shared with you the worst case scenario. Is there things, this is the last thing, like the last two things that have not been attacked are the principal residents. Okay, let's look at the principal residents. We're hearing Trudeau saying maybe he'll say for the first $200,000 you won't pay tax, and then he'll then he'll put a capital gains, raise it up. Well, is there anything that would believe that this would be implemented? Well, in 2016-17, they implemented when you sell your home, you have to actually submit a document to the government. And if you don't do it, you pay a penalty. Okay. Like how hard is it to think that it's going to go further? I also look at the fact that they're implementing this bearer trust, where any agreement that has to do with finance or any trust, and that could be, like I open up a bank account for a child or, things like that. If I don't report it, I'm in trouble. So is there anything that shows me that they're going to make a fundamental change? They did this in 2017. They completely rewrote how corporations, small business people were taxed. And then I look at it almost like there's three shoes here. Well, it's 2017. The government comes out in the summer, the Liberal government, and they say that we're going to completely change how private businesses are taxed because they're tax cheats. Like they're already like sort of like the Soviets, when they would go and say that the farmers in the Ukraine were like the bourgeoisie and they killed them and then everyone starved. Like people don't understand their history. That's exactly what Trudeau started saying. Like these people, why would you want to attack them? You'd want to attack them because if you have a vibrant middle class that's financially independent, they don't have to rely on the government. So they're bringing in people who need to rely on the government. They're actually trying to take away from people who have assets who can say, no, I'm not going to participate in it because I don't need a job. So you have to share, going back to Adrian and I, we've spoken about it. And I have to share with you that 5% in Canada that was smart enough to say, not smart enough, brave enough to say no. I would say a big majority of them were entrepreneurs who had enough resources to say no.
Yeah, there was a lot of people who were unfortunately put in a position that was untenable.
Yep.
And I feel for these people. I don't judge them. I feel for them. They were put in a position of take the shot, or you're going to lose your house. You're not going to be able to feed your kids.
Yep.
But there was a lot of us, people like myself, who were self-employed, who were able to say, no, screw you. You don't have any handle on me.
And now they're going after people like you and I. So we won't have that ability to do it.
Right.
And that's what this budget goes. So getting back to what I was sharing earlier, that money is leaving, smart money is leaving Canada, because they know that eventually that they're going to not have anything, because everything that's being put in place is saying, we will take everything away from you, so you have to bend the knee to us. And I'm going to give an image from a movie that just sticks in my mind that actually shares, for your audience. And maybe your audience, I'm assuming they're our age, so they're going to know this movie. It's Titanic. I just dated myself because this was 1998 or something, 97 it came out. So Kate Winslet, she's engaged to this guy who's supposedly a wealthy asshole. So the boat Titanic is sinking, and this rich asshole, he goes up to the crew member who's letting women and children into the lifeboat, and he offers him a stack of money this big. And the guy says, fine, go in. And then he goes and went to look for his fiancée, who fell in love with another man. And he comes back 7 minutes later, and he offers him this jewel that is worth like $1 billion. And the guy says to him, no, it's worth nothing now. So smart money is doing this. Well, they're saying, I just got slaughtered. Like, in essence, if the real wealth, if I was a wealthy guy in Canada, it was like just to do simple planning, I might be able to, pay 30% tax on my way out in the old world. Now it's 40%. But in essence, eventually it's going to be 0%, because that's where it's moving. So I didn't plan to do this in my career because I'm a nationalist. I work with Canadians in planning to take their money out.
Right.
And I'm damn good at it. I wrote 3 textbooks. I know the Income Tax Act in Canada inside out. I know the tax treaties inside out. And I don't want to say this. I do not want to believe that my country is gone, but I'm not happy with the leadership that's being placed in. We listened to an interview with Pastor Pulaski. Is that his name?
Yes, Arthur Pulaski.
And have you interviewed him?
Yes.
Well, I remember him saying that he was visited by the Conservative Party because they've decided that, they're doing Hegelian dialectics, where they're now going to put in this new guy who was nowhere to be seen until the truckers. Never to be seen. And I've heard questionable things about PCR tests, and his wife was involved in a company. I'm saying this, I'm not in Canada. It's like, it's just basically, it's a distraction. But if you know the end plan, then everything makes sense.
Yes.
And I'm going to step back and leave this with your viewers, where I'm very clear about Canada. Klaus Schwab comes out and says you owe nothing to be happy, and he said not all of us to be robot cleaners, right? And you eat the bugs. In 2017, the same time that Trudeau came out, that we didn't know about it, that, changed the business, how business was taxed. He's over at Harvard speaking to Gergen, who, I don't know, was a Democrat, like insider, and he's in charge of this policy program. And Klaus Schwab is talking proudly about how that Trudeau is his puppet, his dog king, who's he's so proud of him, and he's so proud that they captured. He literally says it on tape. You guys don't have to take my words for it. On tape, that they captured 60% of the Cabinet of Canada.
Yes, and he did. He said that outright.
He did. And so you just, when you look at this and you hear that the fact that plus Schwab and they're open about it, that you own nothing and be happy, this budget that doesn't make sense. Why would you want to go and attack people making business? Why would you want to break down society and overwhelm it with people? Why would you do this? Because if you know the end goal, then it all makes sense.
Yes.
And if that's the case, if a typhoon is coming in, but I read this budget and I read about the Bear Trust and how it's going to make every single Canadian a criminal. And we're talking even the former head of the Bank of Canada, who's the Bank of England, he's also part of it.
Yes.
These guys don't think. They just go and do
unfortunately, Mark Carney is being pegged as potentially Trudeau's replacement. And that would be a disaster, because now you've got somebody who's not an idiot, who understands finance, and who is another WEF crony. And so now you've got somebody who actually is not only on board with their plan, but he doesn't necessarily need them pulling his strings to execute the plan. But anyways, I don't want to get into that, because I wanted to finish up with this question.
Right. Please.
It's something that we have.
Sorry for getting diverted, but you can see
it's quite all right.
Quite passionate.
But I want to get back to just this final question, and I want your thoughts on this. And we were discussing this prior to the interview. $498 billion budget, Freeland announces in March. A month previous to that, she raised the maximum limit that the government could borrow by $517 billion, which means that this year, the government could borrow more money than the entire budget for the year. What do you read into that?
We don't know where any of that money's going. Absolutely no idea. I have no concept of what $1 million is. Sort of like you could tell me a house is worth $1 million. I don't know what $1 billion is. I don't know what $10 billion is. It's like they brought a Nazi that they honored in Parliament, right? And it's like the money's going over there, and we don't get to see what's happening in the Ukraine and how it's being filtered, or how the graft is being paid. We don't see it. And this is, in essence, I think what happens is the ship is sinking. The fiat currency ride is about to collapse, because people, it can't ride unless you have people who borrow, but nobody can afford to borrow anymore. So therefore, it's going to collapse, because when you go and get a mortgage for, let's say, $500,000, that mortgage didn't exist until you borrowed it, and they didn't build in the interest, so they have to go and lend out more money so the interest could be paid. So eventually, they're not going to be borrowing anymore, so it collapses. And that's one of the arguments an individual that I spoke to a while back, Edward Dowd, mentioned. He was expecting that market was going to collapse because the overnight lending, and this for your listeners who don't understand what that is, the banks lend to themselves.
Yes.
And they stopped lending to themselves. So basically the Federal Reserve was printing $2 trillion a night just to go make that happen, because it seized, the whole system had seized at that point. And because they weren't lending to each other. When you stop lending, you stop producing money. You have to find people who want to borrow, and you lend it to them, and they create money out of nowhere. So what occurred is COVID, the economy shuts down, and they have an excuse to print unbelievable amounts of money. But all they did is just hide something that existed, that the fact is we're all exhausted. We can't borrow anymore. And the only thing that happens when we stop borrowing, guess what? It collapses. And that's what's about to happen.
Yeah. So then let me ask you this, because everything we've talked about in this interview about the budget, we keep coming back to, they are consciously bankrupting Canadians.
Oh, yeah.
So now, when I look at that $517 billion in additional borrowing, and every time this government has raised the cap within a couple of years, they've borrowed it, I think they're trying to do the same thing to the country, to bankrupt the federal government so that we're going to end up, you remember what happened to Greece years ago, and the IMF moves in and takes over because the country's bankrupt.
Yes.
What do you think of that? That's what they're trying to do.
They're gonna, of course, this, but you can't look at anything isolated. Well, like for example, we talked about UNDRIP. When they go bankrupt, what are they going to say? We're going to go, like if they follow the Bible, they're supposed to go and give the land back to the original person every 50 years, right? To the family. They're going to give it to the natives, and that's going to go to the UN. It's a reset.
Right. Yes.
That's all it is. But the reason why they're creating this money out of nothing is they're devaluing it, but the people who are closest to the printing press, they're going and buying real assets. And they're taxing real people who have real assets, and they're taking those assets and they're using the fiat money to go and get those assets. And then there's going to be people who are going to leave, they're going to run. And that's what's happening right now. There is this is scary. There is so much money leaving Canada. Like people with money, people who are like going to the States, they're going to Panama, they're going to Mexico, they're going to Costa Rica, they're going to Belize, they're leaving. And these are people who have contributed to society. They were willing to pay their personal taxes because the system allowed them to build a business. And now the system is turned on them. It's like your body, your immune system attacking itself. It's exactly what's happening. What allowed them to do what they did and what they tolerated, they can't tolerate anymore. And I can tell you dozens of really high-functioning individuals that Canada had produced who feel the same way I do about Canada have left. And what frightens me is that image I share with you from Titanic. You can leave now, but will you be able to leave later? If you're going to pay 35% capital gains tax and it's only going to be 25 that you paid before, well, that's better than having nothing. It's like someone chasing their losses, right? It's like, oh, I lost 50%. Oh, it's going to go up 200%. Oh, the Conservatives are going to get the power. It's going to change. They're going to change. I remember that Mulroney put in that GST, and you had Chrystia running back in the 90s saying he was going to get rid of it. He didn't get rid of it. And then you had like Harper, he brought it down to 5%, the GST. And the Liberals who were saying they were going to get rid of it were complaining about it.
Right.
It's like it's all a game.
So, Peter, I want to thank you so much, not just for your time for this interview. Before I can't imagine how many hours you had to put into reading a 430-page budget so that you could come.
Was it for you, Will?
What's in here?
Was it for you? Was it for you? For me to make the decision that I was cutting my ties permanently to Canada. That's why I read it.
Okay.
It was like a letter that your ex-girlfriend sends you. I read it.
Yeah, but more like the divorce papers that inform you that everything is about to become hers.
Oh yeah, that's yes.
Yes.
Not much different.
All right. Thank you so much.
The power of the state against you.